Early this century, in the pitch darkness of a freezing North Atlantic night, there was a violent collision. The lives of all on board, over 1,500 passengers and crew, were held in the balance. But this collision was not that of the Titanic in 1912. The year was 1909. What happened next played a crucial role in determining the disastrous outcome of the tragedy 3 years later. In the early years of the century, wealthy families around the world were gripped by a new craze, the cruise. Americans flocked to Europe to broaden their education, present young debutantes at court, or simply to enjoy themselves. The passenger lines competed to attract new transatlantic travelers. Cunard promoted speed and safety. White Star offered the last word in luxury.
It's very rare on the North Atlantic that you had one ship that answered both necessities, that it be fast and it be extremely luxurious. You either built for dispatch or deluxe. Cunard went after the speed. White Star renounced the idea of speed. They thought, leave that to the Cunards, and we'll go for comfort. And they used to say that you would spend 6 days at sea, but you'd have so much more comfortable a ship, it would be worth it.
In a blaze of publicity, the new owner of the White Star Line, J.P. Morgan, was already planning construction of one of the most lavish ships ever built. The Titanic, one of 3 in his new Olympic class. But what his company was less anxious to publicize was its safety record.
You could describe White Star as a danger to navigation. Their first steam flagship didn't just hit an iceberg, it was carried along by an iceberg and had all its upper works smashed. They had a liner sink on them in New York Harbor under the weight of ice. It went down like a lift. And at the time when they were running the world's largest cargo ship, which was actually a cattle boat, it disappeared in the Atlantic. No trace of it has ever been found. The really astonishing thing about the North Atlantic route is there had in fact been so few fatalities on it.
In a bid to improve safety and to keep up with the competition, White Star commenced installation of Marconi's new invention, wireless. To house the new devices, makeshift cabins were built. For up to 200 miles, passengers could now send and receive personal greetings, track the latest stock quote, or read the news of the day sent by wireless telegraph and printed on board.
The wireless initially, I think, was perceived more as a frivolity almost, a luxury, a reassurance to passengers who might want the latest refinement, just as a driver of a new car would want an automatic shift. This was, in a sense, sort of automatic shift of a shipboard. This was another more gilt gingerbread on the whole creation that you could get on a ship that was in communication with the shore.
On January the 22nd, 1909, the Republic, a major asset of White Star's expanding fleet, set sail for Italy. On board,
Everybody with means did it.
Ten-year-old Hallie was keen to visit the new cabin. There she found a young wireless operator from England, 26-year-old Jack Binns. His services had been leased to the steamship by the fledgling Marconi Wireless Company.
He showed her the whole thing, and she was fascinated. It was called a wireless, and it didn't have any wires that she could see. And then I do remember her saying something about lightning. It must have sent some sort of lightning effect.
Over his previous assignments with White Star, Binns had built up a reputation as one of the most enthusiastic of all the Marconi radio operators.
Binnsy became a Marconi man when he was 12 years old, and first as a messenger boy. It was a very exciting job for him because of the camaraderie of all the other Marconi men who were so excited with this new technology.
The Republic's route that Friday evening took her up the coast of Long Island before heading out to open sea. She would steam through the crowded waters near Nantucket Lightship. With up to 24 ships crossing the dangerous intersection each night, east and westbound lanes were established on either side of the lightship, 30 miles apart. At 11 o'clock that night, the American journalist James Connolly heard the ship's foghorn and went out on the freezing deck.
I studied the black water sliding past at full speed, and I wasn't liking it. I had been on steamers before on foggy nights, but that was on the open ocean. Here was a ship traveling a narrow line for the 200 miles between Sandy Hook and Nantucket Lightship.
Binns would be up for several more hours, sending a flurry of farewell messages before moving out of range of the Marconi station at Sconset on the tip of Nantucket. As the fog thickened, the Republic's 48-year-old captain, William Inman Sealby, left the wheelhouse.
In very intense situations where they could hear another vessel, captains would go out on the wing of a bridge and stop their ships and just listen. Captain Sealby hears very faintly through the fog the whistle of another ship. He doesn't know the identity of that ship, but he knows that this sound appears to be getting closer, and he begins processing what his options are.
Sealby ordered a port, or leftward, turn and sounded his whistle, signaling his intention to the approaching ship. That ship was the Florida, captained by Angelo Ruspini. His 850 passengers were survivors of a devastating earthquake. They were on the last day of their journey from Sicily. The Florida had lost her way in the fog and was searching for the Nantucket Lightship.
On the Florida, the quartermaster, who was at the wheel, may have actually inverted the order and instead of turning to port, turned to starboard. The Republic's form materializes out of the fog. Captain Ruspini probably realizes that something is drastically wrong, and at this point there really isn't any way of avoiding it.
It was 5:47, Saturday morning, January the 23rd, 1909.
Binnsy was asleep in his cabin. All the last messages were sent. goodbye greetings, love letters, and notes about the stock market. And he had just gone to sleep when this incredible crashing came through and grinding, like he said, it was like an earthquake. He was thrown from his bed, found himself soaking wet on the floor with pieces of his cabin sitting all around him. His biggest problem was to find the parts of his apparatus and to ensure that they could work.
The ship's generators had failed under the impact. It would take Jack Binns nearly an hour to make his way several decks below and find emergency batteries to get his equipment running again. With daylight approaching, Binns's transmission range was barely 60 miles. His only hope was to alert the wireless station at Sconset, by now 47 miles away.
It was bitter cold. When he first went to go see Captain Sealby, Captain Sealby, in fact, told him not to be afraid. And he said, "Oh, sir, I'm not afraid. It's just that it's so cold. My teeth are chattering, and I'm shivering, but I'm not really afraid." And indeed, I don't think he really was.
Binns took Sealby's call for help back to his cabin. It would become the first real test of wireless to effect a rescue at sea.
CQD. CQD. Here is MKC. MKC shipwrecked. Republic rammed by unknown steamship. 26 miles southwest of Nantucket Lightship. Badly in need of immediate assistance. Sealby.
Before wireless, communication between ship and shore was limited to the simplest of signals.
Imagine going out in a ship and all you have are semaphores and homing pigeons. Once you can no longer see the shore, you are incommunicado, nothing, until you get to the other shore. That's the situation that people confronted in the 1890s.
Binns's hopes lay with a group of enthusiastic young operators tuning in from stations along the East Coast. It was likely that one of the growing number of amateur operators would be listening too.
The amateur operator was basically the hacker of the early 20th century. And for a brief period, he is greatly celebrated in popular culture.
Specialist magazines were published celebrating the adventures of young boys who put on their earphones and took to what was called the Great Void. By the hundreds, young men had signed up to learn Morse code and become wireless operators.
The young Marconi operators really were sort of a very select fraternity, and there was a wonderful convention they had. They always inserted OM, which was old man, which is a sort of camaraderie greeting that they exchanged over the ether.
The station at Sconset was America's easternmost point of contact for sea traffic between New York and Europe. Its operators mostly relayed mundane greetings from passing ships. But their higher call was to be ready for a CQD.
CQ meant seek you, or seeking you. I'm seeking you. Are you out there? Is anybody out there? And the D was added to stand for danger, so that it was meant to mean, I am seeking you, danger.
Until the morning of January the 23rd, 1909, no Marconi operator had ever sent such a signal. At At 6:42 a.m., the duty officer at Sconset, Jack Irwin, was stoking his coal stove when suddenly he heard a loud crackle coming from his headphones. He started to take down the message. The fluency was erratic. For on board the Republic, Jack Binns had a problem.
The walls of my cabin splintered up and fell in. Had I been seated at the normal operating position, I would have been badly hurt in that mess. While groping in the darkness, I knocked the key and broke it. I had to hold the lever with one hand so I could send messages with the other. I could see nothing outside in the fog and darkness. I had no idea as to how badly our ship had been wounded, or how long she might remain afloat.
Suddenly the sea is pouring in, far faster than any of the ship's pumps can handle. And one of the engineers heroically turned on what was called an injector pump, which actually helped to flood the boilers so that they wouldn't explode. So they literally had a matter of minutes before they were driven from their places.
By the time the engine room had been evacuated, the Republic was sinking at a rate of 1 foot per hour. Without rescue, the ship was doomed. The brunt of the impact was taken by the first-class staterooms on the saloon deck. Passengers there reported a tremendous shock and a huge object tearing the ceiling to pieces. The ship's generators failed under the impact. And on the lower decks, a lack of information was leading to panic.
You now have approximately 700 people, most of whom have been asleep, suddenly awakened by the jar of the collision. They step out into the corridor, the friendly steward isn't there, the lights are out, you can't ring for the steward to ask what the problem is.
Hallie Davis and her brother Henry had been woken by the collision.
There was no lights, and you can imagine how traumatic that was for everybody, including a 10-year-old child. Henry was terrified, her brother, but she was very calm throughout the whole thing.
In about 5 minutes, the man in charge of the staterooms came with a candle, and we dressed hurriedly, and all went on deck. This was the last we ever saw of our staterooms, our baggage, and my teddy bear. I was very fond of my teddy.
Two decks below was the journalist James Connolly.
The noise of the bump came on our side of the ship. I hesitated between a black top coat and a tan raincoat. I decided on the raincoat. It would be foggy and greasy around the deck. I stuffed my notebooks into a pocket and hurried up the grand staircase. I could barely make out the rail stanchions, and I noticed 6, maybe 7 staterooms lay in ruins. My friends, the Lynches, were berthed in one of those. Passengers were coming running, women mostly, most of them in scant clothing. Several spied me standing there and asked, "What's happened? What's happened?" To which I had one answer. "Nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be all right."
One woman dressed herself before everyone on deck, while her French maid stood by and looked on. Several men felt themselves lucky to have a woman's petticoat around their shoulders, and a few women did not hesitate to don trousers and men's shoes.
Jack Binns realized that the fate of the two ships and the lives of nearly 1,700 people lay in his hands. As he struggled with his sending key, the ship's crew tried to maintain order on deck. They brought up steaming coffee and sandwiches. Some of the stewards served whiskey. "40 minutes after the accident, Captain Sealby sought to reassure the nervous passengers. He advised them that they were to be transferred to the vessel which had collided with them until help arrived.
And then he makes a rather classic statement. He says, remember, it is women and children first, then the first cabin passengers, and then all the others. So you actually have class distinction being followed very rigidly on the Republic.
The crew would be the last to leave the ship. Sealby added that he expected all passengers to get into the lifeboats in a calm and orderly manner, in accordance with Board of Trade regulations.
The Board of Trade imposed lifeboat regulations that we wouldn't understand today. The calculation they made was that the number of lifeboats should be related to the cubic capacity of the ship and not to the number of passengers on board. They hadn't really done anything much in this area since 1894. You could almost say they'd fallen asleep or that they'd lost interest in the issue of lifeboats, because the assumption throughout the shipping business was that these ships would actually not sink, and you'd only need lifeboats to take you from a ship that had broken down or been struck or something, from the ship to a place of safety, such as another ship.
As there were not enough lifeboats for everyone, several journeys were required.
What now begins is a whole series of ferryings from the Republic to the Florida, which has luckily come back into view.
There had been no word from the Florida since the crash. The impact with the Republic had crushed her bow, killing 3 of her crew instantly. She was holding water better than the Republic, but her passengers were threatening to riot.
The passengers on board the Florida were not able to cope with this major disaster that's now at hand, coming on top of what they had already experienced in the earthquake, and panicked. Captain Rispini was obliged to break out arms and to use extremely forceful measures to maintain order.
It was now 7:15, an hour and a half after the collision. Working in the dark, Binns was trying to find out if other ships had heard Jack Irwin's relay from Sconset. Irwin had been trying all morning to guide other ships to the stricken vessel. Of the 7 ships he had reached, the closest to the Republic was the Baltic, 90 miles away. She headed straight for the sinking ship. Two hours later, the Baltic was within wireless range. Binns sent another message to Sconset. "I'm on the job," he said, "but the ship is sinking faster."
This was overheard by the wireless man in the Baltic, who said, "Don't worry, old man. We're bursting our boilers to get to you."
Binns calculated that the Baltic would arrive by 11 that morning.
The cold was intense, chilling me through and through. I could barely feel my hands and finally had to put on gloves. My steward had succeeded in scrounging a bottle of Scotch whiskey. I do not think I ever tasted anything so refreshing in my life. Throughout the rest of the day, I slowly sipped that whiskey, a few drops at a time.
At daybreak, the transfer to the Florida began.
My mother's reaction to what has to have been panic, chaos, all of this drama mixed together, my mother seemed to just be fascinated and just almost taking it in as though it were a movie.
With air and sea temperatures near freezing, passengers began boarding the lifeboats. Binns stayed behind with Captain Sealby and a handful of officers. Also staying behind was Father John Norris, who had taken it upon himself to search for any remaining passengers. When he reached the point of impact near the staterooms on the saloon deck, he paused. Two badly injured passengers, Mary Lynch and W.J. Mooney, were dying.
Father Norris realized that Mooney had to be somewhere behind the couch, and with tremendous effort, he cleared the way to get to W.J. Reports say that W.J. was terribly mutilated. Some reports said that he was partially dismembered. In any event, W.J. Mooney was still alive when Father Norris got to him.
Father John ministered to both of them. Before he left, both were dead. By 11 a.m., the Republic was listing badly. The Florida, overcrowded and now down at the bow, was struggling too. On her decks, with no room to move and in freezing conditions, passengers faced hypothermia. The ship had no wireless. Binns knew the Baltic had to be close, and again relayed the Republic's position to the Baltic's operator, Henry Tattersall. But Tattersall wasn't the only one listening. As Binns had anticipated, all along the East Coast, young amateurs tuned into the drama unfolding out at sea. They were soon joined by curious reporters. As the news spread across the country, Sconset was flooded with inquiries, jamming the airwaves to the point where Binns and Tattersall could barely hear each other. Throughout the afternoon, Binns continued to communicate with the Baltic. With the sun totally obscured by fog, it was impossible to take accurate coordinates. The crew could only estimate approximate position by logging every change of course and speed. By 4 p.m., Tattersall's signal strength convinced Binns the Baltic was close, but in which direction?
Wireless is a long-range tool. You can find your position and you can communicate that position to another vessel. But you can't do that in thick fog, where you can't take a sighting, where you're dealing with two vessels moving through this thick pea souper, trying to find each other, and not finding each other with a crunch. So they used to use what were called bombs, explosives that were set off to communicate position.
Baltic. Come to the west of us. Is it you? Baltic. Steer northeast at once. Baltic. There is a bomb bearing northwest from me. Keep firing. Baltic. Can hear your whistle faintly. You seem to be off our starboard bow.
With darkness falling, Binns began to lose hope.
Hour after hour after hour at the key, Binns's hand was literally frozen in the position, and he was just experiencing the greatest difficulty in just manipulating the key, and no food and no light and no heat. And Tattersall, I think, realized that the man at the other end of his signals was a man who was under a great deal of duress, and he sent a lot of encouraging messages to keep Jack Binns going.
Within an area of just 10 square miles, the two ships traveled over 200 miles on zigzag courses. As fast as the Baltic could get to one position, the Republic would have drifted to another. Finally, the Republic had used up all its flares. The Baltic had one left.
They were finally down to the last bomb, and they had everybody, the remaining crew that is, on the Republic arrayed in a circle facing outward in the hope that when the last bomb on the Baltic went off, somebody could figure out what direction the sound was coming from. But the only one who heard it was Binnsy. And Binnsy heard it, he said, because his ear was so trained to faint sounds coming through the telegraph that he could actually tell where it was and what direction it was.
I ran back to the wireless cabin and relayed the steering directions to the Baltic. The last letter had scarcely sputtered out by the wee when the Baltic, faintly outlined in the mist by her blazing lights, loomed up. It was the grandest sight that tired eyes ever saw.
The Baltic was a large ship with adequate cabin space and, more important, public room space to embark these passengers on board. So they did. Despite the fatigue and exhaustion of the passengers who'd already achieved one mid-ocean transfer, to then ask them to submit to the same ordeal again.
The mid-ocean transfer from the Florida started at midnight. It would take 83 boatloads to ferry across the more than 1,500 exhausted passengers and crew. Never had so many people been transferred on the high seas without a single life being lost. And many had done it twice. Only one passenger refused to go. Businessman Eugene Lynch, badly injured and grieving for the loss of his wife, opted to stay on the Florida. By 7 o'clock on Sunday morning, the transfer was complete. 2 more rescue ships arrived and tried to tow the Republic, but it was obvious to Binns the ship was doomed.
I was just about to go to the bridge when 4th Officer Morrow made his way toward me with Sealby's message. I think we are going to abandon ship.
At 8:30 p.m., the Republic disappeared beneath the waves, stern first. She had stayed afloat just long enough for the rescue to be a success. From the Baltic, Binns relayed one last message.
White Star Line, New York. Republic sunk. All hands saved. Sealby.
Construction of White Star's Olympic was now almost complete. And in the berth next door, work was already underway on her sister ship, the Titanic. White Star now had the ultimate proof. Present safety features on their ships meant that there would always be time to effect a successful rescue, even in the unlikely event of a collision. Elegance was now the main focus.
Well, the original plans for the Titanic incorporated 64 lifeboats, and these were gradually whittled down to 20 because they didn't want an unseemly clutter on the boat deck. The large liners were expected to serve as their own lifeboats. They had been constructed with watertight bulkheads, which were meant to keep them afloat for long enough for someone to come along and take everybody off in the event of a collision. The help would be called by wireless. That was another advantage. The ships sailed in agreed shipping lanes, so who needs a lot of lifeboats? And the tragedy for the Titanic in the Republic Florida collision is that this worked. What they'd not thought of was the possibility of a ship being injured by what one would now call a side swipe. The Titanic rubbed along the side of an iceberg and 5 compartments were pierced at the same time. Nobody thought of that.
Newspapers had until now been able to print only those few details of the rescue they could pick up from Sconset. They clamored for a first-person account. As the Baltic entered New York Harbor, James Connolly had just what they wanted.
A whistle came from a steamer, and a voice hailed to ask if a James B. Connolly was aboard. The voice said, "I'm Smith of the New York Herald." I wrapped my 1,000-word dispatch in tarpaulin and hove it overboard. It led a special edition of the Herald, in bold type, on the front page.
Having learned of the drama in the Sunday papers, thousands came out to greet the Baltic. Like many relatives, John Mooney Jr. caught a train after seeing an early newspaper report. Only at the pier did he learn of the death of his father, W.J. Mooney, and of their family friend, Mary Lynch.
My father was gratified, joyous that there were survivors, but a very heavy heart that W.J. lost his life, as did Mrs. Lynch, buried at sea. And there was not a great deal that John Mooney could do about a situation as final as that.
On Sunday afternoon, the Florida, her bow crushed and emergency repairs effected, limped under escort into New York Harbor. 4 hours after she arrived, shipwrights discovered 3 bodies that had been crushed in the initial collision. Dying, Eugene Lynch was carried from the Florida. He had 2 last requests: a brandy, and that a medal be presented to the ship's wireless operator. White Star now waited for the public response.
This collision involving one of their ships was a public relations disaster they probably could have done without. They would not really have relished the kind of publicity that might have accrued as a result. In fact, they would have preferred a miracle, and that's just what they got. The passengers survived, with the exception of a tiny handful, and they had a hero, of course, in the shape of Jack Binns, the radio operator, who had called up assistance, and the whole system worked just as it was meant to work.
Jack Binns was overwhelmed by the public reaction.
The crowds were incredible. He had a ticker tape parade. And he was astonished, frightened in a way. For him, he had simply done his duty. There's a hole in the side of the ship, Jack Binns, the captain above him cried. Give a message at once to the wandering winds. Aye, aye, sir, Jack Binns replied. The captain was brave, but braver was he who sat in his room with his hand on the key and steadily sounded his CQD to people there somewhere outside.
Jack Binns, bravest of all the crew. Jack Binns, the world loves and honors you.
Binns was sought out for autographs, offered contracts to perform vaudeville, even mobbed by chorus girls at the Hippodrome.
He was offered all kinds of ways to profit from his heroism. He didn't want to do that.
Instead, he watched as his story was turned into cheap entertainment by the Vitagraph Movie Company.
It was a very short film which purported to show him on the sending key, and this upset him terribly.
Binns had hoped to use his celebrity to champion safety measures at sea. His role as a caricature in the Vitagraph film was one he could not accept.
And so he sued Vitagraph and won the suit for invasion of privacy.
Binns returned to England to await his next posting. The public, he felt, had missed the point.
To those who read about it in the press, to those who found there was almost no loss of life at all, apart from the collision, it seemed then that this was a clean surgical rescue, with none of the unpleasant death toll that would have tarnished it. So any urgency or expediency Congress felt, for instance, to implement improvement in radio watch, to have people on duty on radio around the clock, was stalled because the Republic made it seem too easy.
In April 1912, 3 years after the Republic Florida collision, final arrangements were underway for the maiden voyage of the Titanic. White Star decided that only one man was fit to be her wireless operator, Jack Binns. But he had met a girl and refused the offer. More than 1,500 lives were lost, the same number that 3 years earlier he had helped to save.
The rescue had gone like clockwork, and those who had assumed the system would work this way felt vindicated. It confirmed this theory. Here was a ship that had been hit. It stayed afloat for 40 hours. The radio was used to call for help. A ship, a large ship, arrived, took everybody off, sailed off to New York. No problem. This was a tragedy for the Titanic, because the Titanic took only 2 hours 40 minutes to sink, and nobody came until it was too late.
cling